Hey everyone, Sean Frangella here for MotionTutorials.net with a new After Effects tutorial about how to recreate the Star Trek Beyond 3D titles that you might have seen in the trailer and commercials, all inside of After Effects using Element 3D and some other plugins and tricks. This episode is brought to you by ArtbeatsEXPRESS. Create a free account at ArtbeatsEXPRESS stock media by subscription and receive complimentary broadcast quality resolution content files. No credit card payments or obligations are required. Click the link for more details. So here we have the completed After Effects project file with everything working, and you can see there's quite a lot of layers and quite a lot of keyframes and even some expressions here and there to do different things. So I wanted to try something different for this one. Rather than watch me drone on for 2 hours about every little dial, detail, and step in the process, I want to go through each section of this so you can get a really solid understanding of how this is put together and how you could put it together without having to sit through a 2-hour video. And at the end of this, if you want to dig into this project file and really look into exactly how this is made and even change it out and make it with your own text or colors, you can get this project file by supporting the show on Patreon at patreon.com/SeanFrangella or heading to the store at MotionTutorials.net, where you can buy movie title recreation After Effects project files for just a couple bucks, so cheaper than even seeing the movie. So let's go through each section of this. We'll talk about how to build the background, the particle effects, the 3D text, and a lot of these little extra layers to add the colors and details. And I figured this way, even if you're a new user, you'll learn a lot. And if you're pretty advanced, you'll learn a lot of stuff too, like track mask, masking effects, and all sorts of little tips. So let's take a look at this. This is our final project file. I color-coded each section of the file so it's a little easier to understand. So first we got this background section that's yellow, and then we'll have our plugins that are green, our shape layers and glows that are blue, and just some adjustment layers on the top that are purple, and that our camera. So that makes sense to me. Let's talk about this starting with the background. If we just solo these layers, here's what we got going on to give us some movement with the background animation. And how this is working is we're starting with this clouds layer, which is actually fractal noise as an effect with a mask then on it for the edges. So if we wanted to rebuild this and understand how this is working to kind of create this organic movement that's going to be our base layer, I'll reset this fractal noise, and it's this fractal noise effect with the type changed to dynamic twist. I scaled it up quite a bit, and you can see this text is red. That's this evolution meter, and if we just scrub through, you can see it's animating endlessly. And the way that we could do that is if we alt click on that and add an expression. I just typed in time times 200, and that'll just keep it moving over time. So we get some infinite animation. And then I got this circle mask on it, and it's set to inverted. So when we have that and the white, we just get it on the edges, and that's set to hard light. Now, what's creating the colors is actually just some shape layers sitting below that. You can see if we take a look at only these ones, there's just kind of a blue shape layer and red shape layers with just some ellipses. If we turn off all these effects, we can see what's going on. And then we're blurring them out, adding a glow and masking it off a bit just to give it some variation so it doesn't look just like circles. And then we got the same thing going on for the orange ones, which looks like kind of silly spotlights here, but when you layer all that stuff together on top of the white, then with the clouds, it starts to make a little more sense. And then I have a basic adjustment layer on top of that with curves added just to punch up the color. So there we got our base background. Let's keep moving up. The next thing to create the background elements is those particles, and there's 2 sets of particles using the plugin Trapcode Particular by Red Giant. So if we take a look at just this first one, those are these background ones that are dancing around. And how this is working is there's a lot of particles on an emitter, and under physics, air, there's a lot of settings adjusted with both this turbulence field and spherical field to make the particles kind of move and dance around over time. And this spherical field, which moves them away from this, has a wiggle expression, so it'll kind of pulsate so it looks a little more organic. And to push those to only the edges, I'm using a track mat on top of it. So a track mat will let a layer like our particle layer reference another layer directly above it and only show either its alpha or alpha inverted, which is the transparency of the layer. So we go to alpha inverted, we get this, or it's luminant. So it's a little bit like mask, but it can be things like video or things like that change over time right above a layer. That way you don't have to animate a bunch of masks or anything. So if we turn on those particles and all our background layers, now we got those particles going on. And if you want to learn more about how to set up Particular in a little more custom way, I go into that in some other tutorials, so be sure to check those out. I don't want to make this one entirely about 45 minutes of talking about Particular, but that's the basic gist of it. Next, we got this slight little flare on the side. You can see it's this little optical flare. If we solo that layer, here's all that is. Now what that is Optical Flares by Video Copilot. If we open that up, here's kind of the effect, and here's the main idea. If we could have this lens flare, those are always fun. And to make it just white, I'm adding a hue saturation effect. So it takes that, and I can just take the saturation completely out of that. So I get just white and grays. And then I'm adding a fast blur just to blur it a little. And over time, that's just moving down a little bit just to keep it interesting. So now we got our background, our main particles, that nice little white flare on the side. And when we put all that together, it starts to look like this. So we're getting our base background. Now the next thing, which is kind of the main point of this whole thing, is our 3D text that has the words Beyond and then Star Trek Animate In. And this is on a layer of Element 3D, which is a 3D plugin for After Effects by Video Copilot. And the way this works with text, if we just turn everything else off, is pretty simple, and that's why it's nice for 3D text in After Effects. All we got to do is make 2 text layers, which I have here. So just the words Star Trek and Beyond, typed out in this Star Trek font, which you can find for free if you just look it up online. It's pretty useful for this, and it's even got that clunky E that drives me nuts, so you know that it's accurate to the actual titles. And then on our Element 3D layer, we can go to custom layers and custom text and mask, and just add in those 2 layers. So there's our Star Trek and our word Beyond, and just shut those off because we only need them for reference. Then when we go to scene setup, we can click this extrude button, and it's going to make a new extrusion of that text, and we can change it from custom path 1, 2, or however many we used, and we can see there's our text. So the way that each of these are set up is I started with this bevel preset to kind of get the basics of it going. So you can see if we take a look at this Beyond one, if we drop any of these on this extrusion, it's going to add these layers of bevels, and then we could move them around and adjust them. So that's exactly what I did. I started with kind of a basic one and then manipulated it to get the look that I want, because none of the built-in ones are exactly this. But what we have here is there's our basic text extrusion, so that's just our blue interior. And then on top of that, there's this outside one, and the main point of this is that this bevel outline is enabled. And what that does, if I turn off the blue, is it just gives us this outline. And then we can adjust things like the bevel curve, bevel size, depth, and make sure this outline is on. And for the outer one, it just changes the Z offset to where it's right on top of it. And then when we're done with that, all we'd have to do is right click and duplicate model. For this extrusion, just change it from 1 to 2, and it's gonna copy the same thing for that second text. And we can just change those so they're not exactly the same, and then they all work together. Let me close out of that. So then we got our 3D text. We can animate it separately on our groups, or we could even, which I've done here, create a group null if we click create for each group. And then we can use these 2 little nulls to move around or animate the position without having to get buried in all the settings for that effect. So the create group nulls is a really good tip for Element 3D. So now we got our 3D text. Let's turn on all our background layers. But this text is just this blue. It doesn't look like those gradient colors with the oranges and the light blue. So how do we do that? Well, on top of this, we're using some tricks with track mats again. If we jump up here a little bit, I have this technique On top of it, if I turn on this bottom glow, there's our orange and it's falling exactly within our letters. And if we move over time, we can see it doesn't leak out. And if we take a look only at this layer, we can see it's actually the front of the text only with our orange. So how do we do that? Well, how this is working is it's actually just, again, guess what? A shape layer with an ellipse, and then that's blurred out with a glow. And to get it kind of look like it's burning and dancing around in there without being too distracting, if we scrub through, you can see it's kind of animating. I have a wiggle expression, which will wiggle our values times per second, comma, units. So that way we don't have to have a bunch of keyframes. And if you want to learn more about expressions, be sure to check out my top 5 expressions videos where I get really into the details on those. So that'll make this shape dance around. Looks pretty cool. Now, the way that we can drop that into only the letters, you can see here I have this hidden E3D layer, and our bottom glow gets that same alpha track matte. So if I delete that, how this is working is we have our main element 3D text. I'll duplicate that, put it above that glow, and then on that glow, change the track matte mode to alpha matte, and it's going to shut off that text, but use the alpha value, so whether it's transparent or not, as a track matte for this glow. And that's really the power of track mattes beyond just using masks. This isn't something that you'd want to try to mask out by hand, but by using a track matte set to alpha matte, we can have stuff like a whole other layer on top of it that can be moving, and use that to knock out the transparency. Right below that, I had another copy of Particular, and this one is pretty similar to the other one. The only difference is that these are really big particles that are mostly transparent. So you see those flying around on the edges a little bit at the beginning. So now if we turn all this back on, now we're starting to look pretty close. And a lot of the details of this is in these little tricks with shape layers set to alpha matte. So that gets us the orange. All these ones that are these blue layers are really doing similar things. So if we just start to turn these on, you can see there's our light blue one for the top letters. There's a brighter white one. There's a white one on the bottom of the letters. And that really helps to make it feel like there's light kind of moving around and make these letters unique. And to get particles within the letters and in front of it without taking up the whole screen, there's another Trapcode Particular layer using that same track matte trick so that there's some extra particles dancing up only within the letters. And then just for final color grading and correction, I have a couple adjustment layers. And I know that was pretty quick, but that really gets us kind of the main overall steps of how we would do this, of creating the background with our noise, creating our particles with Trapcode Particular, our 3D text with Element 3D, and using a bunch of shape layers set to track mattes with copies of that 3D text to add in things like the glows. Now the last thing is the animation, because this isn't just standing still, there's a lot happening over time. If we take a look at the main video, it kind of comes into focus with just the word beyond, has this big pop, and then the word Star Trek reveals, and there's a lot of additional little details. Well, how I'm doing that, to start from the beginning, is there's an adjustment layer right here on top of everything with the effect camera lens blur, and that's blurring everything out. And then there's these extra little blue layers that are all these transitions. And if we turn all those on and press U to look at our keyframes, these are also a bunch of shape layers in kind of organic shapes that are blurred out that all fade in and out. So we can see at the beginning, we get our blur adjustment layer turning off and these white glows turning off. So it kind of all fades in from white, settles into place. And then the second half of this at about 2.5 seconds in is there's this big white flash, and then those all fade out and the word Star Trek and it reveals in as well. Now, how we're handling those for the second part is there's a bunch of these. You can see there's glows. And rather than animating the opacity with keyframes on everything and having a bunch of keyframes, if I press E twice on these transition glows, all of these have an expression, which if we just option click on that opacity to add an expression, we can pick whip it to the opacity of another layer and it's going to write that in. And that way, all we have to do is use one as a controller, and as we make adjustments, they'll all line up. So that's the main thing with the opacity. The other very important little detail, if we solo only our 3D text, is this transition from just the word beyond to where Star Trek appears. And how we're doing that is there's just a mask on the beyond text that right when everything flashes bright white, that Star Trek text appears. And then to add some extra little camera lens focus animation on this, what we're doing is adding the effect camera lens blur right here. If I turn that on and off, and you can see that it's restricted to this mask. And how we can do that, if we take a look through this, is I have this mask, that's this circle. And if I open up all of my effects, under any effects, you can go open it up. So here we got camera lens blur, and there's these compositing options, and there's a mask reference. So if I have this off, of course, it's just gonna blur out the entire layer because that's what an effect does. Well, if we have a mask, so we draw our ellipse mask around just this Star Trek text, and then add a mask reference under compositing options to that mask, so it's mask 2. Now we can see that that camera lens blur actually only appears within that mask. And then on that mask, I'm animating mask expansion, so it actually pulls it in and basically it turns off. And now if I unsolo that, you can see how it all layers together and see really how there's a lot of little details in that transition point as that text reveals. So there's a lot of parts that might seem kind of complex, but it's really some core principles of understanding how we can blend layers together, starting with our backgrounds and our clouds. Again, just get basic colors that don't look like just a bunch of circles. Add some particles in using Trapcode Particular. Add little details like optical flares, and then use our 3D text as a base and really push this idea of using shape layers on track matte set to alpha matte to get these little details like the colors and glows, and then really focus a lot of time on our animation details. If I pop open the keyframes, you can see what's going on to really make it interesting and nice. So if we take a look at the whole thing, now you can kind of visualize a little more of how you could build this together. And it's really just thinking about each part separately, attacking that, and then building it piece by piece, and then adding little details to really blend it all together and make it feel like one cohesive piece. So if you get these little techniques like track mattes, blending modes, basic expressions, and plugins, you can really build anything and really take a look at movie trailers like this Star Trek Beyond one, jump into After Effects and see if you can rebuild it too, like I was inspired to do when I saw this one and I thought it was cool and I wanted to see if I could pull it off and how long it would take. And if you want to dig into this After Effects project file again and you want to learn that way by really getting into this and understanding all the little parts, again, you can jump onto motiontutorials.net and go to the store and throw in a couple bucks. That's super cheap. I'm trying to make it as affordable as possible so we can learn. Or if you want to become a regular supporter of the show, you can head to patreon.com/SeanFrangella, where you can throw in a couple bucks per tutorial and get a couple project files, or even throw in a couple more bucks and get access to every project file I've ever used in my tutorials. That's over 100 right now, so it's a lot of value if you break it down that way. And if you like this tutorial and have any questions, you can hit me up on Twitter. I'm at Sean Frangella, or on Facebook.com/motiontutorials. I love hearing from everyone and seeing what type of stuff they're creating based on these tutorials. And if you want to learn more about other movie title recreation tips, be sure to check out any of the other videos in those thumbnails, as well as some of the other areas that I just glossed over quickly, like particles, expressions, camera movement. I dive a lot deeper into those in some other tutorials, so take a look at those too, and then check this one out again and really put it all together. As always, thanks for watching. I will see you at the next video.